You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
All right, so looks like we're up and running here. So hello, everyone. Good to see you guys again. I'm Erik from the Action Design Radio. Zarak, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Zarak Khan here with Erik, as always.
Zarak, where in the world are you in this
episode? You find me in Washington, D.C.
Wow, that's a lot more boring than past ones.
I know. Anyone who guessed Washington, D.C. gets a free flag pin.
Perfect. And we're joined today. Matt, are you in New York today?
I am. I am at my home in lovely Harlem.
All right, nice. So, yeah, our guest today is Matt. Is it Wallaert? Is that how I say it correctly?
You know, it's Wallaert. I actually was speaking at the French embassy the other day, and it's French-Belgian. And so I opened my speech with, finally, a room full of people who can say my name better than I can. Right? I'm sure it's like Wallaert or something very fancy, but like through successive generations and living in Oregon for a long time, to me, it's just Wallaert.
Okay, that's good. That's a good action item to think of for future podcasts, is double checking the pronunciation before we get on the phone.
Actually, you know, I get all sorts of interesting, fascinating things. The security guard the other day said Matt Wallaert, so hopefully I'm somewhere in line for the billions.
I'll make that your new nickname. It can be Walmart.
So, but isn't that already Omar was? Like,
yeah,
that conquered.
That might be his thing. That might be his thing. We'll probably discuss them a little bit more later on in the podcast, the Walmart behavioral team. But so thanks for joining us today, all the way from Harlem. I'm actually going to be in New York later this week, so I'll have to. I'll send you a message on that. But
let me know.
Yeah, so we're pumped to finally have you. You know, we've been trying to schedule this for a little while, so excited to finally do this and chat some behavioral stuff.
Great.
Cool. So we'll get started. Just a little bit of background. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Like, what's your background, especially your general background, and especially how you got into behavioral science, and what have you worked on in the past, and what are you working on these days?
Yeah. So I, was an academic. Went to Swarthmore undergrad. Did a couple years of research, went off to Cornell for grad school, left my PhD program to go build and sell 2 startups, then went out to Microsoft to do a bunch of sort of behavioral design stuff, then came out to run Microsoft Ventures, and now left Microsoft in November, so just a few months ago, to spend more time with my little 19-month-old son. And so I'm mostly dad these days, although I did recently sign a book deal, so I'm off working on a book and causing other trouble. And of course, as you know, and why we're talking right now, out crusading for this sort of chief behavioral officer role.
For sure. I think that'll be a big topic of the conversation today. Yeah, go ahead, Zarak.
I was going to say, I'm kind of curious. So I was, reading your bio, and I was interested in like the decision behind jumping from academia into sort of the product space at the time that you did, sort of like while you were in the program, as opposed to sort of, some people may find their way there afterwards, but I was interested in your thought process.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an atypical academic, right, in the sense that I'm a first-generation college kid and who really didn't think that psychology was going to be the place I ended up. It wasn't like I, came into school being like, yeah, psych, yeah. I'm from a very rural community where I don't even know if there was a psychologist sort of living in the adjacent 30 to 40 miles, right? Country people often are a little bit suspicious of psych. And so it wasn't really where I thought I would end up. And then, had some really great college advisors. Barry Schwartz was of sort of Paradox of Choice fame, was one of my undergraduate advisors. He and I did a bunch of research together. And, so the way I kind of ended up in academia was it felt like psychology was actually an interesting way to go about changing the world. And I really loved the framework of science for discussion. So I had this really unique experience sort of in my second ever psych class, which with a professor named Andrew Ward, who's sort of known at Swarthmore as one of the best sort of teaching professors. and we were studying the IAT. And I was sort of like, okay, I'm not arguing with their method, but I don't. Their conclusion seems to be slightly overstated, right? I'm not sure that I really believe that they're testing these implicit things that think they are. And Professor Wallaert, Andrew, did one of those really great teacher things, which is to say, well, the rest of the field sort of agrees in this interpretation, but this is science. And like here in science, we have like an organized way of talking to each other. And so you can go run studies that, try to tease out what you think the sort of complexity here is. And that's an acceptable way of like addressing the dominant sort of status quo. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like this continuous iterative thing with like a structured conversation. And so that actually was one of my first publications, was sort of showing that the IAT was malleable and sort of subject to outside interference. And really got me started on this like, oh, psych can be a really interesting way of talking about these really important issues. But ultimately, that's why I ended up leaving academia. There was I was writing the other day actually about when Cornell offered me a spot. Tom Gilovich called me and he was like, look, we really want you. We want to offer you this interesting fellowship. We'd love for you to come here. But you keep talking about applied psychology. And I just want to be really clear that like we're research, right? Like that's what academia does. Like we do research. And I was like, yeah, totally. I get it. Research. Yeah. But then I think, Tom might have been a little bit right, which is I was always more interested in how do we take what we know and go sort of make the world better. And so I think, ended up feeling frustrated with this sort of continuous academic cycle of putting out papers that people didn't read and having debates about sort of science in vacuum as opposed to science in application. And to its credit, I think our field has changed somewhat over the last, 15 years or so. Although still lots and lots of work to be done.
Yeah, and that's kind of an interesting transition because ultimately that's sort of what action design was initially created for. It was just like who's taking this outside of just academic papers and actually applying this stuff in the real world. But there's also a lot of value in just the core research too. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts? Like, do you see like I know as a field we're definitely getting better and we're improving and applying this in a lot of areas, and like I said, the idea of like chief behavioral officers, behavioral teams, which we'll talk about a lot through the rest of the conversation. But do you see a difference in like academia applying it any time recently, or do you think like really if you want to get out, what do you think are the big differences if somebody wants to have an impact? Like, how would they evaluate that decision?
I mean, look, I love academia, and I think the basic research. Right, we can't do anything without the basic research. But to me,
it's kind of the baseline for a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah, but if we sort of look at like the strict utilitarian, and I actually mean like literally increasing the utils in the world. I love that the unit, by the way, of utilitarianism is util.
I didn't know that, but I'm very happy to know that now.
Yeah, that's actually the unit in utilitarianism. In the economic unit is the util. Like if we actually talk about sort of increasing utils in the world, right? Like the natural sort of two-step should be we push, we get everybody caught up to where we are and we're applying it essentially at the edges. And then the research expands the envelope and then we fill in behind them, right? So we're kind of fast following the research with good application. But I don't really think that's where we are, right? We're 10 to 15 years behind in application where we are in research. And so I think as long as that continues to be true, we'll need people coming out of academia and really wading in and sort of bashing heads and making this stuff work. And I do think, I actually think Hillary Mason's a really good friend. And so we've talked a lot about how sort of what we're going through in behavioral sort of science, it mimics some of what data science went through. I think you do see academic programs churning out masters in sort of more applied behavioral economics, applied behavioral science kind of things. So I think academia is responding to the need to train people. But what seems to be missing, I think, is probably the higher level stuff. And I know you and I have talked a fair bit about this. Like, there's just not that many people who've been doing it. I turned 35 about 2 weeks ago, and it was weird to be able to.
Happy belated birthday.
Thank you.
From the action design community.
But it was weird to like think about like, wow, I've been like doing this for 15 years, like the applied side for like 15 years. And that really makes me like weirdly one of the oldest people at doing that. Right.
Yeah.
And that I think is telling, right? Like we can churn out all these master students and I think that's great. But if we don't have people who have a bunch of business experience and a bunch of behavioral science experience going out and sort of shaping the policy piece, that's, I think, going to be really problematic. And that's, I think, where the sort of CBO stuff came in and why, sort of Steve and I and Ohm and I and so many other people are sort of starting to have really more deep conversations about how do we go take this into sort of a more applied realm.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. I mean, I know for us at Morningstar, when we've, looked at hiring people, it's a really, really long process to hire people in a lot of these positions because it's such a unique skill set that almost doesn't exist yet, or it's not something that people commonly have or participate in because it's really kind of unique blend of like, I was kind of thinking about, I wrote a post on how to like start a career in this, and like, as I was writing that, I kind of realized it's sort of this weird intersection. There's like the psychology, and then there's like data science and like technology, and like all these things just come together in like a unique blend where like you don't usually come out of a program or even any job and just have that skill set. So it's really unique.
It is really unique, and as I've been doing this sort of CBO roadshow, talking to a bunch of different companies, it's been interesting to see how they're applying this and what they think is interesting, important, et cetera, and where they're putting people in the organization. I actually have kind of a post in draft about, the sort of like behavioral insights to sort of more behavioral intervention spectrum, right? And so there's this sort of insights piece over here that's often getting, it's going to be a behavioral economist inside of a data group who's lending a perspective, but really to the sort of insight generation piece. What I haven't seen as much, and I think this is where we really need to do some more work as academia, is in the more intervention space, right? Like, because that's actually where behavioral science really shines, right? Is actually, if you think about what an experiment, what's fascinating about, the word experiment gets thrown around a lot. What's fascinating about sort of experiments in psychology is they're actually interventionist, right? Like people are doing thing A sort of preternaturally, and then I'm going to like add on, some outside influence, some outside, sort of structure that causes them to act in some different way, right? And then, that works or doesn't work, and then you sort of iterate over the design of the experiment. But like, it's really about the can I get out this outcome behavior, and what does it take for that outcome behavior to happen? Which I think is really fundamentally different than an insights-driven group, right? I think looking at a bunch of behaviors and saying like, wow, here's this interesting thing that you may not have realized is happening, and maybe kind of why, is really interesting, but it really is the purview of sort of the data side of the equation, right? Data is very good at suggesting where problems are. It's not very good at suggesting how to fix them, right? And so I think that, I don't know, I am fascinated to watch this evolve. And look, data science has done a very good job of evolving it, right? They have sort of broken off ML, AI as the sort of more like applied version of data science, right? The more interventionist version rather than the sort of more predictive analytics insights side, right? And they may actually even be the same skill set, but applied in very different ways. So it's fascinating to me. I had a conversation, I guess I can't say what company, but I had a conversation with a company the other day who was hiring for let's call it mid-level, their first behavioral science hire, kind of mid-level into their data group. And they were like, wow, we really wish we could do what you were doing, right? We really wish, like, for our business model, intervention is actually where we want to end up, but we like feel totally unprepared culturally for like bringing that to bear now. And so I think that maybe what happens is, insight sort of ferments and bubbles a little bit and gets a little more traction and people get a little more comfortable with it. And, they get enough insight reports that have data science baked in that then they're like, oh, well, what if we tried applying this to the solution side?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking about a couple of the talks that you've given that I'd seen and a few posts that I read where, you mentioned like the competing pressures, and I was thinking about that sort of like as it's applied here, which I'm sure it's kind of well, I would assume is maybe the way that you were thinking about it as well. And, like this sort of action intention gap, and how much of it do you think is culture versus some other sort of like infrastructure part of the organization that they just aren't able to sort of bring it in yet?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Like there's lots to your point, right? Because there is this intention gap, like it probably is an inhibiting pressure problem more than most things, right? Which isn't to say I don't think we need to do the work on the promoting pressure side, but like I think when you talk about uptake into businesses, it really is an inhibiting pressure problem. Some of it I think is cultural, like who are these people and who do they talk to and what do they do? And some of it I do really think is structural. Structure is its own kind of culture, its own kind of inhibiting. Like in many ways, like structure and culture are very married together, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's actually, I condensed it down when we sort of wrote the CBO manifesto with the input of so many folks, including Erik. Like, we got it down into one post, but originally there was about 5 posts behind it.
As I said, I remember we initially talked about it was like a series.
Yeah, and I really tried to go deep into like how does the structure actually work and things, and it got a little academic and a little heavy, and so we went with something lighter. But I do think the structural part is real, and there's a, in my mind, perfect way to apply it, and then there's a what might actually happen in the world, right? Like I have very strong feelings about not putting it under the CMO, for example, right? Because I think it then gets applied to sort of the demand generation problems and not any of the other like sort of land of problems. And so the more that the C that they report to, because I do think CBO is a baby C, I don't think it ends up going to the CEO in most companies. If it could be chief strategy, chief innovation, chief operating, like something that has a wider sort of purview piece, I actually think is sort of better and interesting. I actually had a conversation with a big company the other day who was like, what if we put it under the CFO? And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. But they were like, look, in our company, the CFO, who happened to be a woman, sort of owns efficiency. And this to us seems to be kind of an efficiency play, right? It seems like, your KPI, I often say the sort of KPI of a CBO is the NPS of all the other execs, right? If everybody else feels like you're helping them meet their KPIs, right, helping them produce the behavior that they want to produce, then you're doing a good job. And she was like, hey, I mean, that's the CFO's office kind of owns that for us. And I was like, no, I've never, ever thought a CBO would live under a CFO, but I could actually kind of see it. And so I the structure part is really hard. And that's why, I've made such a big deal about doing this publicly and making sure other people are doing it publicly, working with Merits to get, sort of Charlotte has taken on the nomenclature. I'd love to see OHM eventually take on the nomenclature of CBO. I just think that's, there's a see it, be it problem. I work a lot, I'm a big feminist, and I work a lot in sort of feminism and tech. And, you need people to see female engineers in order for little girls to be like, yeah, I want to be an engineer, right? That like, there has to be these exemplar things. And one of the crushing problems of, the sort of 15-year-old applied history of this is that like we just don't have that many people, right? We got a handful of consultancies. We've got, people like Dan Ariely who have done a bunch of interesting demonstrations, but really, it's not like he's left Duke and gone out and like, sort of been the CBO at a big company.
Yeah,
right?
It's really different to just do like a consulting project versus like actually implementing this thing as a company-wide like change or thing.
That's right. With a mission of continual iteration and upskilling, right? Like, when I laid out CBO, I said, right, it's external, it's internal, and it's upskilling, right? Because, we talked earlier about this envelope idea. What I want to see is everybody in an organization from the janitor up, like, understanding basic behavioral science, getting to incorporate that into their daily work so that increasingly the CBO is doing more and more and more, bringing in fresh stuff from academia, stuff at the cutting edge, stuff that's harder, right? Because everyone should be able to sort of push this forward on it. It's a little like being data driven, right? Everyone should have the skills they need to be human driven.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because we've talked with several folks who, we've asked them like what they think the best model is for incorporating this stuff into a company or to a large organization, because there's, in practice we've seen kind of two different models, and one of them sort of like where they bring in like an expert, right? Like, so they would bring in a PhD or a team of PhDs, depending on how large the organization is. And then they sort of split their time across 100 different projects, sort of like dropping in and sharing wisdom and insights, and then kind of go on to the next thing, versus a model where you might still have some subject matter experts, but you spend more time training everyone else that's already there. And so there's sort of like a base level of understanding. And there didn't necessarily seem to be a consensus of like one is better than the other, but it sounds like you're sort of a little bit more in the camp of everyone should have a base level of understanding of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent that they want to, but one of the nice things about behavioral science is it's not a hard sell, right? Like even the janitor wants to understand. If everybody could go back to college, everybody's second degree would be psychology, right? Like there's very few people who are like completely uninterested in understanding humans better, right?
Yeah.
And so like, given that that's true, I don't think it's a hard, my experience has been it's easy to get people to show up for talks. It's easy to get people to show up for education on this because it's of interest.
Yeah, people are super fascinated. So there's like endless demand for just like, the writing, talks, like trainings, stuff like that.
Yeah. And so I think that like, given that, I do think that while eventually you need a team, really your team is just about the size of your structure of your structured problem set, right? If you're a wide organization with lots of problems, you need lots of people. In my mind, I actually think it's a fairly flat org, right? I think it's you have a CBO who kind of runs it, but then everybody else is sort of regardless of junior or senior, like they're running flat, they're being as flexible as they can to meet the demands of the organization, in part because even behavioral science itself is very complicated, right? Like it's like Steve and I don't have the same sort of, we have overlap, but we don't have the sort of same perspective. And so having a flat team that allows for lots of borrowing from each other and calling people in when they have sort of specialty in a particular area, I think is the right sort of way to do it. And one of the subtle things that I think people sometimes miss about this is, and to your point, Erik, about sort of there's very different thing. Consulting is very different than doing this full time. Like breadth of experience in problem set is actually really key, right? It's not so much about I can name every bias ever since the beginning of time. There was a lovely piece that came out over the weekend sort of indicting this like library of biases that we've created and sort of talking about the fact that like it can't just be a library of biases. There has to be a way to apply it. Like I am the worst person in the room at being able to remember the name of every tiny bias. I'm the best person in the room at being able to like actually apply the science, right? Yeah. And so I think we sometimes confuse those two, and I think that's a challenge for us as a field that we need to stand people up. And there are people doing this. It's so ironic to me that the people who are really doing this well are like, the government folks, right? And the nonprofit folks. It's the Ideas 42 of the world, right? It's the like folks that are actually, the nudge labs in the various, it's the US or UK or some of the other governments that have, cities, DC as a lab. Like, it's just amazing to me that like, how are these guys the leaders? Right?
Yeah. Like in what other part of innovation do like, does the government lead like business practices and that sort of thing?
Yeah. It just seems mind-boggling to me that so much has lagged. And, there are places that we've done well, right? Like Laszlo at Google and other places, like doing more or less one piece of it, either the internal piece or the external piece. What we have still yet to do is really recognizing that there's this broad application. Adam and I were talking after the CBO post came out, we were talking about the fact that like it is, the behavioral insights that you and structures that you use to build interventions in marketing are exactly the same things that you build like for motivating employees, right? Like that is the same science. So to have them like segmented off is very weird.
Yeah, you make a good point that, and I would say this is when I first started getting into this stuff, this was like not at all what I expected, but like ultimately behavioral science is more of a process than it is like a theory or anything like that. Like I said, like you don't have to be the best person at knowing every cognitive bias. Like you need to know how to like see how to map out the current behavior and then understand what the ideal or what the goal is, And like there's a whole process of doing that. Like, what we find in applying this stuff, in a work setting is like you don't really need like you said, behavioralists are definitely the best at the intervention part, and a lot of times that's useful. But sometimes just having the skill to visualize this process for people and be like, it's just a lot of times it's very obvious. It's like, well, okay, this is a really confusing piece of this process. So like, let's run an experiment and see some different ways to simplify that. Like, it's like really knowing that process, that end to end, is like what I've kind of learned is really the bread and butter of things. It's like, and like you said, like once you have that process, it's repeatable anywhere. You can do it in a product, you can do it in marketing, you can do it in HR, you can do it with live events. I mean, there's just when you have that whole process down, and there's different levels of complexity for each one of those. But yeah, it's really knowing that system and process of application rather than knowing every bias and every theory of psychology and stuff like that.
Yeah, what's interesting, the example I sometimes give, I borrow this one from Ohm and have my own sort of spin on it, right? I talk about like, people spend a lot of time in a Walmart. They spend not that long in line, but yet if you survey them afterwards, they're like, I was in line forever and it was awful, right? And so, I sort of paint this vignette, if you go around a company like Walmart, if you bring it to the engineers, they'll be like, well, we could redo the POS so people get through the line faster, right? And if you bring it to the ops people, they'll be like, well, we could knock out 2 aisles over there and then we could put in more shopping lanes, right? And like, the marketing people are like, well, we could run a campaign about like how, wonderful it is to be in Walmart, right? Like, everybody pulls the lever that's next to them, right? Because that's the lever that they understand. And one of the things I think is really special about behavioral science is it doesn't care about the levers, right? It only cares about the outcome behavior, right? Like the great thing about the Skinner box is like it's behavior first. And then it's like, well, what combination of levers can we pull, like sort of agnostic to which ones we own, that like result in that outcome behavior. And I think that's where you actually get a lot of value. To your point is sort of the floating above the individual sort of like siloed application of a thing, and instead saying like there is human beings, whether they're being marketed to, walking through a line, whatever, like behave in these predictable ways. Like really the levers we're pulling are just human levers. Like let's go pull the human levers using the tactic that is marketing or engineering or operations or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those levers vary so much. Like that's what I find is like kind of exciting about it can be exciting and frustrating, I guess, of like applying it the more and more in the real world. Is just like you find so many inconsistencies between like very minor differences in populations, but just completely different things work. And like that's why the process is so important, because there's no like grand theory that always works for people, So like that process of testing everything and understanding which ones work for the given population you're working with was vary so much. Unless you have that process, you can't just like plug and play and like use kind of the start working through a list of nudges and just assume they're all going to work well.
Yeah, it's sort of that interplay between design and intervention. I think one of the downsides of sort of the lean startup movement, which has been so just get something out there and then iterate. Like iteration is great, but it's not actually design, and we shouldn't mistake it for design. Like you want to actually do the upfront work using the science that to build a solid intervention, then take that intervention to market and test it, right? And then iterate on top of it, right? But it's not just, well, throw spray and pray, product innovation out there and then, iterate on whatever works and see what happens. Because
that's
to your
some intention behind it, yeah.
Yeah, well, because, the difference between working and not working in air quotes on that initial test, maybe some subtlety, right? So you have to have some conviction that says, no, the science really says this should work. Like, let's not abandon it. Let's sort of jiggle it a little bit to see if we can figure out like why it's I sort of liken it to like jiggling a key in a lock, right? Too much of intervention assumes that like what works instantly is what works forever. Right. And so it just throws things out there and then says, OK, well, whatever works, like that's the thing we're going to go with. Whereas there might be a much better intervention, but you have to do that half step of like, OK, the first experiment didn't work. Right. And that's again, this is where scientists shine. Right. Because we have theory and experiments. Right. So we have a theory that says this is the way, like I have a hypothesis. Right. Given everything I know from the past, I have a hypothesis about how this should work. And if it doesn't work, that doesn't mean like blow it up. That means figure out why it's not working,
Yeah, when you get in like the real world settings too, it's like there's like different elements to that theory and hypothesis. Like and that's where it's helpful to have somebody with the knowledge to know a lot of the studies and things, but then you combine that with the expertise of like the product owner or like, the developers who, know the users better. So that's like that marriage of those two, like just the unique data to that problem plus like the grander theory is like where you come up with like really cool stuff.
And I actually think that that's one of the really, at least for me, has been one of the most personally rewarding things about being a behavioral scientist, right? Has been learning so much about things that I didn't know anything about, right? In the process of helping other people with, whatever their sort of behavioral design challenge was, I've just had this tremendous opportunity to like learn about stuff that like, my first company called Potlight Lending Tree, I didn't know anything about mortgages, and now I know a ton about mortgages, right? I've been, I didn't know anything about reinsurance. Now I know a ton about reinsurance. You just learn about all these industries you didn't know anything about because it really is that guide on the side model, right? It's not, I'm going to come in and tell you how to fix it. It's, I always laugh when I spend some time with folks because, I usually give this sort of competing pressures talk to give them a foundation, but then it's like, okay, for like an hour, I need you to just tell me about your business, right? Tell me about your business. Tell me about your problems. Tell me what's working. Tell me what's not working, right? And everybody's like, aren't you supposed to be telling us stuff? And I'm like, that was it, man. That's like, until you give me more input than that, right? Like, that's the a priori talk. Now it's like time to talk about what your actual things are and work through, applications together and stuff. And I think that's been really sort of fun for me. And I think it's one of the inherent things that could be really valuable at this career that path as we open it up for people is it does allow people who are kind of polymath, are kind of like interested in lots and lots of things to have an outlet for doing that in a sort of constructive way. They're not a generalist, right? Behavioral scientists aren't generalists. They're experts in a particular thing, but you can scratch that generalist itch to learn, right? Yep. Lots of new stuff without necessarily having to feel like you need to be an operational person in all of those things.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And how is the breadth of experience that you've had, how did that inform like kind of your roadshow that you have been on with CBO?
I mean, having so many weird experiences makes it a little easier for me to talk to companies because no matter what your problem is, I've seen a problem that looks like your problem, right? And so it's a little bit like if you've ever spent time with a really great psych teaching professor, what makes them really special is, hey, I can teach the framework, and then no matter what you say next, I have some example, right, that will be relatable to you, right? If you tell me a few things about you, I will find an example that's relatable to you. And so I think for me, having this breadth of experience previously and then talking to new companies that I didn't know anything about their thing, with 10 or 20 minutes of I'm having a problem that looks like this, I can say, oh yeah, like these guys over here were having this problem that looked like that in this other industry, right? Like here are some of the things we did, here are some of the things that worked, here are some of the things that didn't, right? Yeah. That's, to the sort of doing this in public point. I'm really, really excited about, the fact that the publication's coming out. I'm excited that Charlotte over at Merritt and other people are talking about doing more stuff in public because I think that's the way we have a multiplicative effect. Right now, Matt has lots of examples of how he's done this in lots of weird places, right? And I try and write as many down as I can, but I'm not exactly a prolific writer. We need to do more of our science, our applied science in public so that, there can be more horizontal applications so that junior people have something to take and, try applying at their places. Because if everybody has to start from scratch on every single problem, that's a huge just waste of time.
Right.
And helps people see what's possible. It's like to your example of like, like you mentioned of like, getting more female engineers, like you need, they need like role models to look to. And like it's the same way with looking at applying this, where like you need examples to draw from that like visualize to you that it's possible, and that like have done the path and have seen the same sort of barriers you're overcoming to get there.
And to Zarak's point, like Zarak's point about sort of like the flip side of that is also the business outcome piece, right? It's important to be able in a roadshow to be able to say like, get raised, $2.3 billion in raises, right? Like being in the classroom, 40% increase in searches, right? Being able to quantify that impact on a business level has also been really helpful. So it's not just the like, let me tell you about the sexy intervention, right? Because not all interventions are sexy, right? But they can have really big business impacts. And so being able to sort of be clear about what the business impact of various kinds of things has been also key.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody wants to do behavioral science just to do behavioral science. Like they want the business outcome that brings,
That's right.
Which, since you mentioned Get Raised, I feel like we should do a plug for it because I just heard about it when I was sort of doing research for our chat today. I was like, this is awesome. So
for folks that don't know, Get Raised is a thing that we built a few years ago that was in this sort of competing pressures design, right? Promoting pressures, reasons to do something, inhibiting pressures, things that make things less likely. We sort of hit on this insight that the problem with the gender wage gap wasn't that women didn't want more money, right? So it's not a lean in message, right? It's not a promoting pressure problem. It was inhibiting pressures. It was things that kept them from asking or made them less successful. And so we built a little calculator that makes it easier to ask. And doing that has obviously, as we mentioned, $2.3 billion in raises had sort of outsized results. And but the key insight was really, we treat this like a promoting pressure problem, and everybody else from lean in onwards is just treating it like a promoting pressure problem, but it's really not, right? It's really an inhibiting pressure problem. And just that sort of, was enough to sort of get us thinking in the right direction, to have sort of outsized impact. I think, as I sort of said in that Virgin talk that you're sort of alluding to, Zarak, this is our way to change our world, right? One of the nice things about behavioral science is that it can be applied by almost anybody in almost any circumstance to sort of generate something better. And marketers and other people have been, spending billions of dollars, making us more obese. This is how we fight back, right? This is how we control. I remember when the soda ban was coming out here in New York, I was NPR called me on NPR and just screaming at, people are like, how dare, right, people you try and influence what I'm doing. And I'm going, you recognize that the soda industry is spending $2 billion, billion dollars, advertising to you, man, big money, right? This is not we won't win, right? Even if we pass the soda ban, we're still not going to win, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's hard for people to, and one of the reasons people are reluctant to do behavioral science in public is this notion that nudging and other things are sort of bad words, right? People don't want to be influenced, right? They don't want to be sort of, nudged, right? And so one of the big barriers is just helping people see you're actually being nudged and influenced all the time in good, lovely, wonderful ways, right? And it's just about doing it in a consciously good way as opposed to the consciously bad way.
Yeah, that's exactly.
Kind of an odd.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Erik.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's exactly I definitely understand apprehension of this stuff sometimes because it's easy. I think people, probably rightfully so, know they're being manipulated all the time. I mean, that's what a lot of advertising and stuff is when it comes down to it. And so I get that apprehension, but then when they're they're apprehensive about doing these nudges and stuff, and it's that's always the point for me. It's you are being influenced, and it's worse if just somebody built something without any intention behind how you're being influenced, because then it's happening one way or the other. So how can you find the best way that works for the people that are using it? And actually be intentional about that and have a proactive goal with how this thing designed rather than just you were always being influenced. So how can we be proactive about that influence? And there's obviously a lot of subtleties in the ethics there and, understanding the people that you're designing for and such. But it's happening one way or the other. So let's be proactive about that and do it in a way that's helping people.
Well, the alternative is to tie one hand behind our back, right? It's to say, well, somehow, because you're doing it for good, you're not allowed to use any of these tools. That's a guaranteed way to lose. That's what that is, right? That's giving up, right? And I'm not there. I think that intelligent defaulting is perfectly fine, right? I think that I have this debate with my brother sometimes, right? The rabbit's out of the bag, man. we know these things, and now that we know these things, it is about whether we're going to apply them in a way that is to the benefit of mankind or not, right? But you can't like put the genie back in the bottle. That doesn't work, right? Turning a blind eye and saying, well, we can't nudge over here, like that's just not going to work. So, Doc, you had a question, man.
I was just gonna say it's kind of funny, like, and a little bit counterintuitive, but there have been times like when I've actually used marketing as a way of explaining it to people, and then they're sort of like more comfortable with it. They're like, oh, it's like mind control, and like, no, it's like marketing and sales, but to encourage you to like be healthier or save more money. Like, oh, okay, yeah, which is it's sort of a weird kind of counterintuitive thing. You would think that
it's actually one of the biggest problems with Get Raised is that it's free. People are very, very suspicious in the modern era of not understanding what your incentives are, right? Yeah. And so I think I've had the similar experience where like explaining how a company makes money using behavioral science perversely makes people more comfortable with its usage, right? Sort of being like, oh, okay, I get it. I get who benefits. I get why this makes sense. One of the sort of jokes my friends like to tell is like a Matt Wallaert solution is one in which like everybody wins, right? Where there's this like grand triple win where like the company profits and the individual, like, it's socially good and the individual gets what they want, the company profits, and he's like, that's a Matt Wallaert. And I think that's what behavioral science actually can do a lot of the time, right? And that sort of goes back to the experience point we were making earlier, Erik. Like, it's only sort of after a number of years of doing this that you start getting smart enough about business to be able to look in a situation and say, well, hey, you spent a half an hour telling me about your business. Like, here's a thing that seems to actually be a revenue driver for you and is in the best interests of, checking bags is a great example, right? Like getting people to check bags on an airline. Like, if it is actually advantageous in a commons problem sort of way for everybody to check bags, like, it's one of the significant reasons of delays, right? It's we don't push off fast enough because people don't get seated, like all those other kinds of that we have to get stuff underneath the plane. Like, it's better for everybody if we all check bags. And so doing things that convince people who don't absolutely need their bag on the flight to check bags, assuming no fees, is like actually quite good. And so I think there's a lot of things like that where, if you just spend enough time with people, you go, well, I had no idea that's how you were making money, right? Like, given that you're making money that way, I actually can make your life a whole lot easier, right?
Totally. And so I'm kind of curious, like, in addition to, including sort of this message about the bottom line and like the business, the revenue impact or the business impact, what are some of the other things that you have kind of either included from the beginning in your kind of pitch for this, or that you have sort of like learned along the way in your conversations of what you might want to include? I'm kind of thinking of this because, we've got a lot of listeners out there who are, hopefully we can enlist them in this as well because they're, interested in this kind of work. So, I'm sure that they're also excited about the prospect of, a CBO type position.
I think it's important to recognize that it's probably mostly an inhibiting pressure problem, right? Like, minimize the amount of time that you're selling behavioral science and let behavioral science sell itself. Let the TED Talks, let the books, let people's natural interest, like, just run through names until you find somebody they've heard of, right? So they've seen Barry or Dan or like, read a Malcolm Gladwell, like they've seen one of these something, right, that has already captured their attention. So rather than trying to be the smartest person in the room, rather than trying to be the person that's like, demonstrating why they should want to do this, demonstrate how easy it is. Here's how the people you kind of go hire. It's really cheap because it has low operational overhead. Like, and I'm the kind of, I think emphasizing that it doesn't have to be insanely expensive and that they don't have to like start with a team of 30. Right? Because so often businesses, often look at it as if they were looking at a new product line where, you need not only executives, but operators and builders and all sorts of other things, saying like, hey, just hire one, right? Like, start with one behavioral scientist and then build as you discover new problems, as you get oversubscribed, as like the business, reality comes out. Like, you don't have to think of it as a massive team, right? Because even at the, even at the sort of Walmartian scale, right? Some of the biggest companies on earth, should this department ever be more than kind of 10 or 20 people? Probably not, right?
It's a very scalable process for,
Yeah, I mean, like, especially if you're doing the upskilling piece, right? If you're good about the upskilling, that means your team is only really taking on the more advanced stuff. And so, like, it shouldn't at scale need to be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in this massive cost center that doesn't get you anything, right? It should be relatively lean. I don't think it has to be as expensive as often people think. The expensive part may actually be that first recruit, to Erik's point earlier. Like, recruiting in the space hard to find the right person. Hard, it's a little bit like non-technical people hiring engineers too, right? Because how do you sort of differentiate between the sort of people who blow smoke about this stuff, and we can all name some, and the people who are actually doing the applied work, right? I think that's an unfortunate reality for many companies, is how do we actually go get those folks? That said, the nice thing is, because it's academic, go to your local university, pay a professor or grad student a reasonable amount of money and ask their help in sort of vetting people, right? Because I think that getting a little bit of expertise, you can tell very quickly, is this person sort of who read one book and is now just spouting the name of biases, or is this somebody who's actually built something? And I do, maybe that's my bias because I'm a builder, but if I have a bone to pick with our industry, it is stop telling me about your fancy design thinking things and just tell me what you've built. Right? Because if you can't show me anything that you've ever built that's been successful and tell me exactly how you built it and tell me exactly what the success was and tell me all of the metrics, then I'm just not interested in listening to you. Right? This is not a theoretical thing. We are in the applied science side, right? And that means you have to use the rubric and metrics of applied science, which is having built, right? And so, no hand waving at projects, right? No hand waving at well, I can't tell you about it because it's secret and it's special. And I've consulted to many large companies. Great. What did they build? Right? What did you help them build, and how did they?
Yeah, and that's the same attitude that the business leaders that ultimately will make the call to have a team like this have, is what is this outcome? I think it is easy to be in sort of a bubble in this field where we're always excited about this stuff. Obviously behavioral science is so cool and so interesting and can do all this stuff, but like I said, it's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company doesn't care about doing something cool. He's how does this affect our goals? How does this make our company better? So it starts with the outcomes, and you're really getting the buy-in for that stuff.
And to your point, Zarak, I think for listeners, that's a sort of a call to arms for you, is go build something, right? It's not very hard. Pick a local nonprofit and do an intervention, right? Because you're going to learn a lot. If you've never done an actual in-world intervention, and run it start to finish, you're going to learn a lot from doing it. And you're going to need that kind of thing to be able to point to, I think, in the future, particularly if you want to get hired by somebody like me, you want to get on my team, the first question is going to be about applications, right? Tell me how you're using it. Right. Yeah,
and that's something I wish I would have done earlier. I got to know it and I got involved in all these sorts of things, but I hadn't really gone and done an experiment or something like that. And it was you have to create those opportunities for yourself when it comes down to it. When I wrote my post about starting the career on it, I had a friend of mine read the draft, and one of the suggestions she had was add one of these, which is your current job. You can do this whatever you're doing right now. There's no reason to wait until you can work at an Ideas 42 or for a CBO or somebody. Anybody can do this. So if you're interested in this stuff, find a way to run an experiment or do some behavioral intervention with your current job, or you said, find a nonprofit or someone that will take help. Just find a way to do it. There's no reason to not get started and wait for this perfect opportunity and permission to do so.
And this is the most friendly community on earth, right?
It really is, yeah.
If you're nervous about running your own experience, call me, call Erik, call somebody, and write us an email and say, hey, I'm kind of thinking about this, and we'll give you some free advice. And it's not, this doesn't have to be scary, right? It doesn't have to be intimidating. It's meant literally to be something that the janitor can do, right? And that's the level at which I try and design it, right? It has to be something. If I can't get an 8th grader to understand this, then I'm not interested, right? At least the basic framework.
Yep. Yeah, no, you're sure. It's a really friendly community, and it's really not a big community. Like this is still a pretty small field. It's like once you start meeting a few different people, like you almost know everyone within like a few months. Like it's really, people are really accessible, and and it's just not that big. There's not that many people out there doing this. So you can build a great network and get a lot of mentorship. I mean, that's kind of how I got it. I don't really have a formal background, but I just got some really good. I reached out to people and got some really good I helped them out, and I got some really good mentors who've taught me on the job essentially. So
and that's a key point actually, is the formal education bit. I mean, I think formal education is really important, and I think it being able to run experiments and things is really important. But what I'll say is, given the current need, nobody's if you can prove that you can do it, I don't care how you learned it. Right. Sure. All I care is that you can do it. Right. Right. I said earlier, right, we're outcomes based. I'm outcomes based. Right. If you can show me that you can do this, if you can get in a room and draw the arrows on the board and help me understand how you're thinking about this. Right. Great. I don't care if you got a PhD or not.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I definitely wish I could go back and do undergrad and do this stuff more. But I got on a path and started learning it. And it's worked out. So, but you need to, if you're going to do that, you do need really good teachers, really good people that are going to share you those skills for sure. But they're learnable. But they're learnable outside of an academic setting.
Right, and just recognize that if you're coming to the field new, there are people who have been doing it a long time, and find somebody like that, work with them, work under them, work near them, and learn what you can from them. Don't try and read one book and then sell yourself to the world as a CBO, or open up your own consulting shop. Right? That's not the structure. The structure is not go open up your own consulting shop. It's go do things near people who are doing real things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really what I get excited about, outside, there's we have a few of these consulting firms that are doing really interesting work, but what I'm most excited about as a next step, and we think you would echo this, is this opportunity of making this a part of how companies do business. The consulting shops are doing awesome work, but we're still defining what that CBO function looks like, and how this works in reality in a big company, and in business.
Yeah,
in general.
Absolutely. And you can be a part of that. It's an active discussion. Go write your response post. Go tell me, what do you think a CBO is like? Everyone opinions. We are in the formation stage. Yeah, all opinions are valid.
Still very malleable. Yeah, there is no right way to do this. So that's that can be frustrating at times, but it's mostly pretty fun.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, have fun with it, right? I think humans are supposed to be fun. Right? We're built to be fun. And so if you're not having fun, you should take a step back and really evaluate why that is, and surround yourself with people that are doing it. And I think that, that goes a little bit earlier to, we're talking about sort of the morality and the nudges and that kind of stuff, right? If you look at the Uber article and other things, I don't think it's that hard to step back and say, am I using this in the right way? Right? Human beings are pretty good at having a moral compass once they get outside of the circumstances that they're in. Right. And so that's one of the benefits of the community is, hey, if you feel at all that you're being asked to manipulate behavior in a way that you think might not be great, you should go talk to somebody in the community outside of your organization who can help you think that through in the right way. We have ethical practices and standards for a reason. Experimentation proceeds along ethical lines for a reason. And that maybe is one of the things that doesn't come as much without a formal education is some of the ethics stuff. And so if you are concerned, go find somebody who's had some of that, deep, thoughtful training about experimentation and come back and talk about, what isn't in the purview. But I really do think if you consult somebody who's outside of your circumstance, you very often will get maybe a different answer than what you see from the inside, where you're like, oh, this is fine, totally fine.
Get out of your confirmation bias.
Exactly. I mean, the best way to apply this is on ourselves. And by the way, and this is, I think, important for all listeners, nobody is any better at this, right? Like, I've been studying this for a really long time now. I still suck, right? Like, I still make bad decisions all the time. I still fall victim to advertising all the time. Like, the more you know, the more you realize that you fall victim to all of these biases.
Well, you uncover your faults.
Yeah, you're just conscious of your own and it can. I've seen that get depressing to people. It doesn't actually depress me because I'm sort of endlessly fascinated by my own faults, but like, it can get sort of burdensome to realize that you're signing up for something that's just going to show you what an idiot you are. But welcome to being a human.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, like, for myself, like, the benefits of, like, the improvements that I've, not just in business, but just for myself that I've been made understanding this stuff far outweigh, like, just like any of the negatives or the things I still get tricked by or whatever.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as a guy who wears the same thing every day, I have this little script on eBay that buys the same clothes and have eliminated that decision from my life. And
wait, you have a script that just like repeat buys?
Yeah, it actually. So yeah, it has.
Oh, that is one of the most amazing productivity hacks I've ever heard of. That.
Yeah, it does. So I'm a little famous.
Auto buy.
No, seriously. Like, I wear John Varvatos blue jeans and a John Varvatos 40R blazer and a Nordstrom trim fit shirt and cowboy boots every workday. And the
uniform.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a lot better than the hoodie. It's a lot better than the Zuckerberg hoodie. It's a lot more.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm kind of. It doesn't matter to me what it is. It matters to me that, like, and I'm not saying fashion should die, right? I'm saying
it should be cowboy boots.
Yeah, I'm saying, pick what you love, right? And if you want to wear something different every day, and that's where you want to spend your mental resources, do that. But don't spend your mental resources on something that you don't actually care about, right? That's the number one sort of life hacky behavioral science message, which is spend your resources on the shit you actually care about and not what other people tell you you're supposed to care about, right? If, like, your job is not your number one passion, that's fine. Like, take the first job that comes along that gives you enough money to fulfill what you need, and then throw yourself into your hobby if that's your thing. I think that's an okay thing in the world. I'm really sick of the world telling people what is an okay or not okay way to spend their mental resources. There's a great, if you ever seen the movie Training Day, there's a great sort of scene, Ethan Hawke, I hope, no spoilers here, I hope, but Ethan Hawke gets sort of. If you have not
seen Training Day, pause and fast forward.
Pause, that's right. So Training Day, it's cops and one of them's dirty and one of them is not dirty, and the dirty one sort of gets the other one high. And so Ethan Hawke is high. And they go to visit this older retired cop's house. And so it's Denzel Washington is the sort of bad cop and Ethan Hawke. And Ethan Hawke sort of semi-comatose high. And then, the old cop and Denzel Washington are sort of talking and they're talking about the secret of the streets and stuff. And Ethan Hawke sort of pipes up, I know the secret of the streets, belligerent, drunky sort of thing. And he says, control your smiles and cries. And Denzel Washington tries to shush him, but the old cop says, no, I think he's onto something. And I think that that's actually a really valuable point, right? It's not automate your clothes or don't automate your clothes. It's automate whatever the hell is not your thing, right? The example I often use is, like, I can tell you every part in every computer I've owned since I was like 13 years old, right? And started building my own computers, right? That's a place I want to spend a lot of time. I want to read a lot. I want to know a lot. I care a lot. I want to talk with other people who care a lot. Clothes isn't. Right, I got to look good enough, and that's kind of it. Right, once I hit the minimum bar, in psych terms, this is it's not maximize consistently or satisfies consistently. It's satisfies in the areas you don't actually care about, and maximize in everywhere else. Right. Mm-hmm. Someday soon, I think actually somebody's going to make a food service that's just going to send me good enough food. That's all I really want. I want cheap enough, healthy enough, easy enough to prepare. Right, food that I don't have to make any choices about. Don't give me menus. Don't make me choose things. Don't make me cook it myself. I think it's probably going to be
eat and provide it.
That's right. And it's probably going to be frozen food. I think is that's sort of as I talk to people in this industry, that's kind of what the emerging consensus is. But, like, you can make really great fresh, sort of snap frozen, healthy frozen food that, like, I can thaw out and eat kind of randomly, and it all tastes good and it's all reasonably healthy and it's all, like, portion controlled and, like, great. Great. That's what I want. I want to tell you that I don't particularly like chicken and I do like Asian food. And then, go.
Yeah, it's such like a behavioral insight, just priorities are important and like you can only do so much stuff. You only have the mental capacity and time to do so much stuff. So like you want to be proactive about those priorities and understand like which is going to take up, like you said, that limited mental bandwidth and the time that you have and what's going to give you the most ROI with that. And you're also going to experiment with that. It's going to change over time. You're going to find some things, maybe you pour all your time in your hobby and find, I don't really like this actually. So
That's fine, and that's fine, and you'll learn.
yeah.
And like, time and money are really just proxies for me for mental attention, right? It's all at the end of the day, the sort of the fungible unit is sort of my mental headspace, and I think that spending that on the things that you really care about, putting your phone aside and having uninterrupted time with your kids, for example, really is key and really is important to sort of spending a delightful and satisfied life, right? The two individual components of happiness, I think, really come about from being thoughtful about how you're spending your sort of focus and attention. And it's hard, right? Because there are things that you're normatively supposed to spend attention on. I think as we get to neuromarketing and a bunch of other sort of like interesting new approaches to sort of marketing, I think one of the greatest insights that I think marketing people can get is that it's not time and it's not money. Those are all just proxies for brain. And, getting the closer we can get to that and the closer that we can enable people to choose the things that they want. I like Star Trek and I like science fiction in general. I always tell product people to read a lot of science fiction because I think what science fiction does well is take the constraints off a particular problem and then, sort of talk about what might happen. In Star Trek, it's post-sufficiency, right? So we sort of solve the sort of like everybody has enough food, everybody has enough power, everybody has enough clothes. Like we sort of solve this problem. And what do people do, right? Idiocracy would suggest we like sit around and watch reality television, and maybe that happens, but I don't think so, right? At least some meaningful portion of us go out and explore the universe, right?
Or live on the holodeck.
And that's fine. Like I think the world is best arranged when we concentrate on removing inhibiting pressures so that everybody can follow their own individual promoting pressures. And if your promoting pressure is like making music or playing with your kids or whatever it is, great. Like let's try and remove the inhibiting pressure so that one of the key insights that I think people lose track of is promoting pressures are heterogeneous, inhibiting pressures are homogeneous. We all suffer from a lack of time. We all suffer from a lack of money. We all suffer from these things up at the top. Our motivations are manifold, right? And continued, there are going to be new, weird, special things that you can get interested in, and that's going to expand horizontally forever, right? Very few have fallen off the map. And so the more time that we spend reducing these inhibiting pressures, that's how we achieve freedom, right? Freedom of thought, freedom of action, freedom of belief is to remove the inhibiting pressures that allow people to follow their individual path.
Yeah, that's so interesting from a behavioral perspective to think about this. Like, I could know on this topic, like one thing I read this article a while ago and I started doing this for myself. It's like, never say you don't have enough time, say it's not a priority. And like that clarifies things really fast. When like all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, I haven't talked to my mom on the phone in a while. Like I just don't have time. Like, oh, it's not a priority. Like you start to feel pretty guilty when you start saying priority. But then there's other things like I like kind of want to learn language at some point. But I'm like, right now it's just not a priority. I have other things I'm working on. And like down the line, it probably will be one. But from that behavioral perspective, when we talk about all this, is like so many of us have things we need to do. Like we need to be exercising, we need to be eating healthy, we need to be contributing to our retirement. And we know that's technically a priority, but it's not an active priority. Like we don't want to spend time out of our day checking our retirement portfolio or actively transferring money to the bank. And that's where all these opportunities are as behavioralists, is like to bridge that gap so that people can achieve their goals without it taking away from their hobby, from their job, with time from their family. That's an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if I think about my favorite products, Ellevest, robo-advisors type of stuff to solve that sort of finance problem you just indicated. I love Peloton from a sort of, stick a bike in my home and I'll ride it sort of perspective. I think there's a lot of products that I really love that are on the inhibiting pressure side. because I think it really does allow for, you to do those basic things, and someday they'll figure out how to make me exercise in my sleep.
What a time to be alive that will be.
I can't believe we've never thought of making it a permanent question before, but I think your most unique productivity hack or mental bandwidth hack, I think that should be a standard question going forward, because the eBay clothes buying one is definitely, I think that's a great one to kick it off with.
That's up there, yeah.
Yeah, it is, I have to say, it saves a serious amount of time. I have not been to a store to shop for clothing like in years, right? I just spend literally zero time doing it, right? Like, the eBay thing sort of buys stuff and puts it in my closet, and I have a closet full of John Varvatos blazers, and the real only thing I have to do is figure out when to turn it on and when to turn it off, right? Oh, I ruined that shirt, now I got to get a new shirt. But other than that, it has been so great.
Yeah, and we're fortunate to live in a time where people criticize some of these lifestyle startups that just deliver stuff to people, but think about it, it's a really cool time when you can pay a little bit of money to have your groceries delivered and save however many hours you would spend getting to and from and in the grocery store and still have good groceries and good food and stuff. It's you can automate pretty much everything now. So if there are things that you aren't automating for the most part, it's you have to sit and find those, figure out what those priorities are. There's probably a tool out there that can at least help in some way,
Yeah, and the part of that's actually, I think, people leave on the table is that they build the sort of privileged version of them, right? If you look at grocery delivery, so much of grocery delivery is based around choice, and often choice around sort of premium products and sort of,
it's always organic, high level.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the really great, to me, sort of potentials here is to say, hey, what do we have a surplus of, right? And knowing that we have a surplus of stuff and I can get it, I can work economies of scale, what can I then distribute to people who don't have a ton of money, right? And, because the thing is, choice adds costs, right? Choice always adds cost. And so if you take things to the radical notion that you don't have to have choice, right, or that you can have extremely limited choice and actually derive significant sort of economies of scale from that, right, we do stand a real chance of sort of feeding people, clothing people, doing things in interesting ways.
Yeah, you talk about scarcity of time and mental resources. It's the poor have the most problems of scarcity there is, because they have limited money, and then they have to work a lot of hours to make the equivalent. It's just, if you want to take these sorts of things, technologies that we're doing, and really move the needle and human quality of life, that's a really good place to look. How can you alleviate those scarcities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I spend a lot of time, working on the underbanked problems in the United States, and I always am somewhat annoyed by the default assumptions that people make about the underbanked and about the poor. They're not bad parents. They are working 3 jobs. I'd like to see you be a good parent when you're working 3 jobs, right?
Yeah, without the nanny around or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many times, even with help, even having the financial resources that I do, that I'm tired and not a perfect parent, and I snap at my son or don't respond in the perfect way that I would like to, right? And that's with all the resources in the world, right? And so as soon as you start stripping away resources and, making people, try and take on those burdens entirely by themselves, I think that's really just such a killer. And it's sad to me that I hope that people start looking at some of this automation stuff and saying, how can I adjust it for a population that isn't about disposable income, right? That it's instead about sort of economies of scale. Right. Driving the price point lower rather than trying to keep the price point fixed and increase sort of margins.
Yep. All right. Well, we're getting close to our time here, so I think we can probably start looking at kind of wrapping up with some final thoughts. Yeah, it's crazy. I think without actually looking at my question list, I feel like we kind of went through everything for the most part, just naturally. So
I appreciate that you guys sent me the questions in advance, and I hope that you appreciate my response, which is to say, I'm not going to read these, and we'll just loosely talk about behavioral science, because I think that that's where the really good stuff comes out. I wish there were more of that, right? I want to see more conferences, more panels, more discussions, more things that are less formal and also that involve argumentation, right? I don't think we argue enough as a field about some of the things that we do and don't agree on. I think it is okay for us to step on stage and disagree with each other and still be friends at the end of the day.
Definitely. That's how we move forward. So any like final thoughts? Is there anything like particular, obviously we know what you're working on now. So you're working on a book about the CBO topic. Is that correct?
No, the book's about sort of the competing pressures model and sort of.
Oh, okay.
I want to build something that's fairly accessible. I mean, I think the stuff that Steve has done has been great, but maybe I think there's more interesting work to continue to do on the sort of application side. So I want to try and it's hard, man. It's hard to thread a needle of making a book that is both deep enough that you're communicating good science, but sort of broad enough that it allows people to access it in a way that they can walk away and apply in their lives. Because that for me is, I don't care about selling books, right? The goal for me is that after reading this book, someone could go and change something in their life. And whether that's their personal life or at work or in the lives of others, like I want it to be applied. And, when you try and teach application, man, it turns out to be way harder than I thought. It has really been stretching me to work on it, and I appreciate the opportunity to do it. And it really has been. It's a lot of fun. They're talking about sort of fall 18 if I meet all my deadlines and things. We'll see, but it's certainly getting written.
Cool. Anything else you're working on people should know about or kind of follow?
I mean, look, you know me, I turn out a new project every month, right? Like,
Yeah.
I constantly have new feminist tools coming out. I'm doing a lot of different, applied feminist stuff. It's what's interesting. We had to talk for an hour and a half. I didn't talk about almost anything that I've actually designed. Perhaps countering my own sort of.
They can check your website for that,
Yeah, the interesting stuff about what we're designing. I'm working a lot these days on how to bring more men into feminism. What are the sort of inhibiting pressures to sort of men doing the right thing when it gets to sort of feminist causes? What I frequently say as a designer is that everything, as a product guy, everything I built is a reaction to the failings of the thing as I built previously, right? So like in the way that Get Raised was a reaction to the things, Thrive only looked at stuff post-paycheck, and there was inequity pre-paycheck, so we got to go build Get Raised. And then Get Raised says that the disadvantaged group needs to change their behavior, right? It says, hey, women, you're the disadvantaged group, but you should be the ones that change. Well, I don't love that. So right now I'm working on like, okay, well, how do we go to the advantaged group and change their behavior, right? Like, and I'm sure I'll screw that up, and then I'll build something new, and I'll screw that up, and I'll build something new. And I think
that's kind of the behavioral science process. You solve one problem, just end up with a bunch more to solve a lot of times.
That's right, and that should be, if you're doing it right, and if it's the right field for you, you'll love that. It can be occasionally a little bit frustrating, but you will
never be bored, for sure.
You'll never be bored. That's right. You should solve one problem and then be like, well, now, there's something else to go solve. And I think, that's one of the things that I think sometimes people miss out on in their ego is like, and one of the things I didn't like about academia is it's like, oh, you're working on something and then somebody releases a paper that shows that they've been kind of working on the same thing, and you're like, bah, they beat me to it, right? And I'm like, no, that is precisely the wrong attitude, right? To me, that just means, great, I don't have to work on that anymore and can go work on one of these other 20 million problems, right? Like, there is a global balance sheet of problems that we are globally trying to solve. And who solves which one is largely irrelevant to me, right? If I wake up tomorrow and somebody has come up with like the better Get Raised, I will be ecstatic, right? Like I will be like, great, like I can go solve something else now. So I think maybe that's the final wrap up is, don't fall into the trap of who can make the cleverest, sexiest, weirdest intervention, right? Remember that there are real problems in the world that we are solving. Most of us, if you got far enough to be able to be a behavioral science, got enough education to get here, you are better off than 99% of the world. And, the world has invested tremendously in getting you here, and you owe the world a debt. So get off your lazy ass and stop, building the upteenth million way to sell credit cards and build something. right? Build something that moves the needle for a lot of people, and look around you in whatever organization you are and look at all those levers that are around you and find one that you can pull that makes things better, right? Because no matter what kind of organization you're in, even if it's a credit card company, right, there's a way to make better credit cards, right? There's absolutely, I am convinced there is a way to make a profitable credit card that is good for people. And it's your job to go figure that out.
That is a fantastic ending point to stop with. Anywhere, how should people keep track of you? How should they keep track of your work, or reach out, anything like that?
I try to be really transparent and easy to find. Matt at mattwallaert.com, at Matt Wallaert on Twitter. There's nothing fancy.
Just Google your name. There's plenty there, but yeah.
Yeah.
You're very active on Twitter, and your website's a great resource too.
I'm a bad blogger, but I do occasionally get stuff out there. I will answer your email. It may sometimes take 6 months. I answer every piece of email I receive. That's not spam. But
it's a noble quest.
but some of it gets triaged into a folder that says, I've been on this plane for 18 hours. Maybe I'll answer some email now. So I will get back to you, and please look around and design a world that is better for other people. Right? It will be better for you if it's better for them, I promise.
Awesome. Well, Zarak, any parting words?
Oh, no, other than just thank you for joining us, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Zarak. I appreciate it, man.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time. Really appreciate it. We're excited to get this out, and let's go solve some problems.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Take it easy.
See you guys later.
Bye. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available for download on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once more, that is action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States, plus Toronto. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.